floors. Among the crowd walked a tall black man in a dark blue suit. His steps were calm, his shoulders straight, and his expression relaxed. Most people around him didn't pay much attention. To them, he was just another traveler on another busy day. But the truth was different. This man was a CEO, a leader of one of the most successful companies in the country. He was also a major investor in the very airline he was about to board. He carried himself with quiet dignity. His phone buzzed with emails, but he ignored them for now. Instead, he looked around at the people rushing past him. He had traveled the world many times, met presidents, signed contracts worth millions, and spoken at international conferences. Yet in this moment, he was just a passenger going home to see his family. When he reached the boarding gate, he handed his ticket to the smiling attendant. She scanned it and said politely, "Welcome aboard, sir. First class seat 1A. He nodded with a gentle smile and thanked her. Some other passengers looked at him, noticing his seat assignment. First class was a luxury, and many wondered who he was to sit in such a position of comfort. But he didn't care about their looks. He had worked hard for everything he had achieved. As he entered the aircraft, the cool air and soft lighting welcomed him. The first-class cabin was nearly empty at this moment. Plush seats, extra space, and quiet surroundings promised comfort for the long flight ahead. He placed his briefcase neatly in the overhead bin and sat down in 1A, the VIP seat near the window. He exhaled, ready to relax, maybe even close his eyes before the journey began. But the peace did not last long. A flight attendant with neatly tied hair and a crisp uniform approached him. She leaned forward slightly, her voice polite but with an edge of hesitation. "Excuse me, sir," she said, "there seems to be a mistake." The CEO looked up calmly. "A mistake?" he repeated. The airplane cabin was now filling up as more passengers entered. The quiet whispers from earlier had not completely faded, but they had softened into the background noise of people finding their seats, storing their luggage, and talking with their travel compa. The first-class cabin was silent, yet the silence was heavy, not peaceful. Everyone had just seen how the truth came out, how the quiet black man they thought was an ordinary traveler turned out to be a powerful CEO and investor in the very airline. The atmosphere inside the plane shifted in an instant. The plane had leveled in the sky, cruising smoothly above the clouds. The earlier tension in the cabin had not fully faded, but it had changed into something else, something more thoughtful. Passengers were no longer whispering with judgment or curiosity, instead, they were reflecting silently on what they had just witnessed. The black CEO sat in seat 1A, his rightful place, with his laptop open in front of him. The soft glow from the screen lit up his calm face. To him, it felt as though the flight had finally begun. For the rest of the passengers, however, the flight would never be just another journey. It had already turned into an unforgettable lesson. The remaining flight attendants moved carefully, their steps quieter, their tone more polite. They made sure every passenger was comfortable, but whenever they approached the CEO, their words carried a deeper respect. They no longer saw him as a man who could be brushed aside. They saw him as a figure who carried authority even in silence. But the CEO did not act like a man who had won a battle. He did not raise his chin with pride or treat the attendants with coldness. Instead, he carried on with quiet dignity, as though nothing had happened at all. To him, the incident was not about revenge, it was about principle. It was about showing the difference between arrogance and respect. A man sitting across from him kept stealing glances, unable to hold his curiosity anymore. He leaned forward slightly and said softly, "Sir, I just want to say, the way you handled that situation, it was powerful. You didn't even raise your voice, but you made the strongest point." The CEO looked up, his eyes kind. "Thank you," he replied calmly. "Sometimes silence teaches louder than shouting." The man nodded slowly, impressed. He leaned back in his seat, still thinking about those words. Nearby, the woman who had whispered to her husband earlier found herself lost in thought. She remembered how she had noticed the unfairness when the CEO was moved, yet she had said nothing. Now guilt rested on her shoulders. She realized how easy it was to stay quiet, and how costly that silence could be. She turned to her husband and whispered, "Next time, I won't stay quiet. I'll speak." Her husband squeezed her hand, agreeing. "So will I." Even the white passenger who had first taken seat 1A sat in deep reflection. His embarrassment was clear on his face. He had accepted the seat without question, enjoying the privilege, not thinking twice about the man who had been forced to move. Now he sat quietly, ashamed. He wanted to apologize again, but the words felt too small for the weight of the moment. He lowered his head, hoping the lesson would change him in the future. The CEO continued working, but every so often, he looked up and scanned the cabin. His gaze wasn't harsh, it was thoughtful, almost fatherly. He could see the change in the people around him. Their eyes no longer carried casual dismissal. Instead, they carried respect, humility, and a new awareness. As the hours passed, meals were served. Conversations started again, though this time they were softer, more careful. People were choosing their words differently. They looked at the attendants with fresh eyes, aware that respect had to be given to everyone, not just to those who appeared important. At one point, a young passenger, a college student traveling home, gathered the courage to approach the CEO. He stood near his seat nervously and said, "Sir, I don't mean to disturb you. But I just want to say, I'll remember this flight for the rest of my life. You showed me something my parents always told me, but I never truly saw until now. That real power doesn't need to shout. It speaks for itself." The CEO smiled warmly at him. "That's a good lesson to carry," he said. "Remember it not just for yourself, but for others too. Whenever you see someone treated unfairly, stand for them. Your voice can mean everything." The young man nodded quickly, his eyes shining with respect, before returning to his seat. Hours later, as the plane neared its destination, the captain made his announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." The passengers obeyed, but the cabin carried a different feeling now. It wasn't just about arriving at the airport. It was about what they would carry with them after stepping off the plane. As the wheels touched down and the plane rolled to a stop, people gathered their belongings. Usually, first-class passengers were quick to leave, but this time many of them paused. They looked toward the CEO, almost as if waiting for him to move first. When he finally stood, they watched him quietly. He gathered his bag, closed his laptop, and straightened his suit jacket. His steps were calm as he walked down the aisle. Some passengers nodded respectfully at him as he passed. A few even whispered, "Thank you." The CEO acknowledged them with a small nod, but he didn't linger. For him, it was not about recognition. It was about the lesson that would stay behind long after he left. As he exited the plane, the story spread quickly among the passengers. Some pulled out their phones to share the incident with friends and family. Others simply held the moment close to their hearts, replaying the lesson again and again. The attendants who remained were quiet too. They had seen what happened to their colleagues, and they knew this was a warning for them as well. From that day on, they would never again look at a passenger as just a face or a color. They would remember the man who taught them that respect must be unconditional. Outside the airport, the CEO walked calmly through the crowd. To most, he looked like just another traveler heading toward his car. No one would have guessed the storm that had taken place just hours earlier. He carried himself with the same quiet dignity he always had. But behind him, the story was alive. It would travel from mouth to mouth, from phone to phone, until it became more than just a flight incident. It would become a reminder to never underestimate people, and never to judge them by what you see on the surface. For the passengers who had been there, the memory would stay forever. They would remember the silence of the CEO, the shock of the reveal, and the words that carried more weight than anger ever could: respect is a right, not a privilege. And as the CEO stepped into his car and drove away, he knew he had left behind more than just an empty seat. He had left behind a lesson that would live far beyond the flight itself. The attendants who had pushed him aside stood frozen, their hands clasped nervously in front of them. A few minutes ago, they were confident, smiling, and in control. Now, they were pale, their eyes wide, their breaths shallow. They didn't even know where to look. Some stared at the floor, others looked at the officials who had entered, waiting for what would come next. The officials, on the other hand, looked serious. They didn't raise their voices, but their tone carried authority. "You may collect your belongings and step aside," one of them said firmly. "You are relieved of duty effective immediately." The cabin gasped again. Passengers glanced at one another, whispering in disbelief. It was rare to see airline staff dismissed in front of customers, and even rarer to see it happen so quickly. But this moment was not just about rules or jobs, it was about respect, dignity, and justice. The CEO remained calm. He did not watch them with anger. His eyes were steady, but not cruel. He wasn't enjoying their downfall, nor was he smiling at their humiliation. He sat quietly, his hands folded, like a man who had already moved beyond the moment. The dismissed attendants slowly gathered their items. One of them, the woman who had spoken to him so sharply earlier, looked like she wanted to say something. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. She lowered her head and walked away, escorted gently by the officials. The passengers were stunned. A murmur rippled through the cabin. "I can't believe it, they just lost their jobs. Well, they treated him terribly. They thought he was nobody. That's the danger of judging by appearances." The white passenger who had been seated in the CEO's rightful place looked the most uncomfortable of all. His champagne glass sat untouched now, his hands fidgeting with the seat belt buckle. He kept glancing toward the CEO, as if waiting for him to acknowledge him, but the CEO never looked his way. The shame burned deeply, and he sank into his seat, wishing he could disappear. After the officials led the dismissed staff out, the cabin grew quieter. The remaining crew members returned, but their expressions were different now. They were respectful, almost overly careful, as they served the other passengers. Every time they approached the CEO, their tone was gentle, their gestures polite. They no longer saw him as just another man in a suit, they saw him as someone whose presence demanded respect. The CEO finally stood. His tall figure drew every eye in the cabin again. He didn't rush or move aggressively, instead, he walked slowly toward the front. His voice was calm, yet it carried to every corner of the section. "I do not share this moment to embarrass anyone," he began. "But I must say something. What you saw just now is not about power or wealth. It is about respect. Respect should never depend on who someone is, how they look, or what seat they hold." The cabin was so quiet that even the sound of the engines outside seemed far away. Passengers leaned in, listening closely. He continued, "I had every right to this seat. My ticket said so. But I was asked to move not because of a real mistake, but because of an assumption. This happens to people every day. And most of them cannot speak up. They cannot send a message or call officials to defend them. They simply accept the unfairness, and the world looks the other way." A woman in the second row wiped her eyes quietly. She had been thinking about how often she had seen people judged unfairly in her own life. The CEO's words hit her heart like a mirror. The CEO paused for a moment, letting the silence sink in. Then he added softly, "Dignity does not come from a uniform, or a job title, or a seat number. Dignity comes from being human. And when we take that away from someone, we take away more than we realize." The passengers began to clap again. This time, the applause was stronger, louder, filled with genuine respect. Some even stood briefly, showing their support. The CEO nodded gently, acknowledging their reaction, then returned to his seat. The white passenger finally spoke, his voice shaky. I'm sorry, he whispered, though his words were almost swallowed by the sound of clapping. The CEO heard him but did not respond. Not out of cruelty, but because the moment was larger than personal apologies. The lesson had already been delivered, and the silence that followed spoke louder than words. Once the applause settled, the mood in the cabin felt different. People looked at each other with a new sense of awareness. A few smiled at the CEO respectfully. Some looked embarrassed for having stayed silent earlier. Others sat deep in thought, realizing how quickly assumptions could destroy fairness. Meanwhile, the CEO returned to his seat, the rightful one. He placed his laptop on the tray and opened it as though nothing unusual had happened. His composure impressed everyone. He did not boast, he did not scold, he did not even let anger show. He simply carried himself with the same calm dignity he had displayed from the beginning. The rest of the staff treated him carefully for the remainder of the flight. They offered him refreshments, addressed him with Sir Aitnians. Yet in the first-class section, an invisible tension lingered. Everyone who had seen what just happened could not forget it so quickly. The plane had just finished boarding. The sound of seat belts clicking, overhead bins shutting, and last-minute announcements filled the cabin. The atmosphere looked normal to an outsider, but for those who had witnessed the earlier exchange, there was still a quiet tension. The black CEO sat in his reassigned seat, his posture calm, his eyes steady. He had already sent his short message, and now he simply waited. It had been only a few minutes since the incident, but time seemed to stretch. The passengers who saw what happened could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. Some looked at the CEO with curiosity. Others pretended to ignore him, as if distancing themselves would protect them from the awkwardness of the situation. Then, suddenly, the cabin door opened again. This was unusual. Normally, once the passengers were seated and the flight attendants had finished their checks, the doors remained shut until the plane pushed back. Heads turned as a small group of airline officials stepped inside. Their uniforms were different from the cabin crew, dark suits with company pins on their lapels, their expressions serious. The first-class passengers straightened in surprise. What was happening? Why were airline officials boarding now? The group walked quickly and directly toward the first-class section. Their eyes scanned the seats until they found the man sitting calmly, phone in hand. Without hesitation, the lead official approached him. His voice carried a mix of respect and urgency. "Sir," the official said, lowering his head slightly, "we are deeply sorry for what has happened. Please accept our apologies." The passengers around them froze. They stared, confused. Apologies? To him? The CEO nodded slowly, acknowledging the words, but he did not speak yet. His silence was powerful, and the officials seemed even more nervous because of it. One of the passengers leaned toward another and whispered, "Who is he? Why are they apologizing like that?" Before the other could answer, the lead official continued, turning toward the staff who had forced the CEO out of his seat earlier. His voice grew sharper. "Step forward." The attendants who had been smiling and serving drinks only moments ago now looked pale. They hesitated, glancing at each other, their hands trembling slightly. One of them, the very one who had asked the CEO to give up his seat, took a slow step forward. The cabin grew quieter. Even the sound of the engines outside seemed to fade. Every passenger was watching. The official's tone was cold now. "Do you realize who this man is?" he asked. The attendants did not answer. Their eyes darted nervously. "He is not just a passenger," the official continued. "He is a valued partner of this airline. A shareholder. A leader." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Several passengers exchanged shocked looks. The whispers started instantly. A shareholder? A leader? A CEO? All at once, the story shifted. The man they thought was just another traveler, the one they had seen humiliated and dismissed, was revealed to be someone with great power. The white passenger in seat 1A stiffened. His champagne glass trembled in his hand. He glanced quickly at the CEO, then looked down, his face turning red. The smile he had worn so confidently earlier was gone. Meanwhile, the passengers who had stayed silent during the unfair treatment now regretted it. Their eyes were filled with guilt and surprise. The calm man they had ignored was suddenly the most important person in the room. The CEO finally rose from his seat. He stood tall, his presence commanding without effort. His voice was quiet but firm, carrying across the cabin with clarity. "I had a ticket for this seat," he began, gesturing toward the VIP spot where the white passenger now Saturday. "My boarding pass clearly showed it. Yet I was told to move, treated as though I did not belong. I did not argue, because sometimes silence is stronger than words." The passengers listened in complete silence. Even those who had not seen the earlier incident now leaned forward, drawn into the gravity of his words. He turned his eyes toward the attendants. "This is not about me. I will be fine. But what about the people who cannot defend themselves? What about the ones without a title, without a name you recognize? Do they deserve to be treated this way?" A murmur of agreement rose from the passengers. Heads nodded. The truth of his words sank deep. The officials lowered their heads further, their faces filled with shame. They knew what was coming. "Respect," the CEO continued, "is not a luxury reserved for a few. It is the right of every person. Whether they wear a suit or simple clothes, whether they sit in first class or at the back, whether their skin is dark or light, it should make no difference." The cabin erupted in soft applause. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was sincere. Passengers clapped, some with tears in their eyes, moved by the quiet strength in his message. The attendants who had wronged him shifted nervously. Their faces turned red, their voices stuck in their throats. They tried to speak, but no words came out. The officials did not wait any longer. They spoke with finality. "You are relieved of your duties. Collect your things. You will not serve on this flight or any other." A gasp of shock spread through the cabin. The staff who had moments ago appeared confident and in control were now dismissed in front of everyone. They lowered their heads, realizing their mistake had cost them more than they could have imagined. The CEO did not smile, nor did he gloat. His expression remained calm. He was not interested in revenge, only in justice. He walked back to his rightful seat, 1A. The white passenger who had taken it quickly stood up without being told. He mumbled an apology, his voice trembling. The CEO nodded slightly but said nothing, his silence more powerful than any words. As he sat down in his rightful place, the passengers continued clapping softly. Some leaned toward each other, whispering in awe. "Can you believe it? He's a CEO, and a shareholder in this airline. He didn't even raise his voice. He just sat there, and now everything has changed. This is a lesson. Never judge someone by what you see." The CEO adjusted his seatbelt once more, opened his laptop, and began working calmly, as if nothing had happened. But everyone in the cabin knew everything had changed. In less than 10 minutes, a man who had been treated as though he didn't belong had revealed himself as someone whose presence commanded respect. The same staff who had dismissed him were now gone, and the passengers who had doubted him were left humbled. And all of it had happened because he had chosen patience, silence, and dignity. The whispers continued for the rest of the flight. Some passengers looked at him with admiration, others with guilt, and many with newfound respect. But no one could forget the moment when the truth was revealed, and the cabin learned the power of quiet strength. The black CEO sat calmly in his new seat. It was comfortable, yes, but it was not the seat he had chosen and paid for. More than the seat itself, it was the way he had been treated that left a mark. He leaned back, holding his phone in his hand, typing something with steady fingers. His face was unreadable, neither angry nor defeated. If anything, he looked like a man waiting for something inevitable. The white passenger who had taken his VIP seat stretched his legs and leaned back with a sigh of contentment. The flight attendant came over, smiling warmly at him. "Would you like a glass of champagne before takeoff, Mr. James?" she asked politely. "Yes, that would be wonderful," the man replied with a grin. He didn't even glance at the CEO who had given up his place. It was as if the moment had already been forgotten, swept under the rug. The CEO noticed this, but he didn't let it disturb him. Instead, he quietly adjusted his seatbelt and set his phone down. The screen dimmed, but the short message he had typed earlier remained there, ready to deliver change. A faint smile touched his lips, not of amusement but of quiet understanding. Around him, passengers exchanged small looks. A woman sitting diagonally behind leaned closer to her husband. Her voice was low, but her words were filled with unease. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Her husband nodded. "I saw. It didn't feel right. His ticket said seat 1A. I don't know why they moved him." "Do you think they did it on purpose?" she asked. Her husband didn't answer right away. He glanced toward the CEO, who sat composed, almost too composed. "Maybe. But whoever that man is, he's not ordinary. Did you see how calm he stayed? If it were me, I would have argued." The woman agreed, her eyes filled with quiet respect. "There's something about him," she said softly. Meanwhile, the flight attendants bustled about, offering drinks, adjusting luggage, and checking seatbelts. Yet a few of them couldn't shake off a strange feeling. They had noticed the way the CEO had looked at them, calm, controlled, but with a weight of authority that they could not quite explain. Still, they brushed off the thought, focusing instead on serving the other passengers. The CEO pulled out a small notebook from his bag. Unlike many who traveled with the latest devices, he often carried this notebook to jot down ideas, reflections, or notes for meetings. He opened it, flipped to a clean page, and began writing. His pen moved smoothly across the paper. A young man sitting nearby noticed and felt curious. In a world where most people were glued to screens, seeing someone write by hand was unusual. "What is he writing?" the young man wondered silently. He couldn't know that the man was sketching out thoughts for an upcoming board meeting, one where his voice would decide the future of the very airline they were sitting in. But for now, the CEO remained just a quiet traveler in the eyes of most. Only a few around him sensed there was something more. The engines began to hum louder, a sign that takeoff was near. The passengers settled in, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, and the crew made their final checks. The CEO closed his notebook and placed it carefully in his bag. He looked out of the window, watching the ground crew outside moving with precision. In front of him, the white passenger laughed at something on his phone, showing it to the attendant, who giggled politely. The difference in treatment was clear, and though some passengers noticed, they chose not to speak. Silence was easier. Silence was safer. But silence also meant complicity. The CEO shifted slightly, pulling his phone back into his hand. He scrolled through a few emails, then paused at the message he had drafted earlier. With a gentle tap, he hit send. The message went out, short and simple, but powerful enough to trigger a chain of actions that would soon shake the cabin. Only a few minutes passed, but those minutes felt strangely long. The passengers carried on with small talk, the attendants continued their duties, and the white passenger enjoyed his champagne. But for those who had truly paid attention, the atmosphere was heavy with a sense of something waiting just beneath the surface. A young woman sitting across the aisle noticed the CEO's expression. She had been watching quietly since he entered the plane. She couldn't understand why someone treated with such disrespect could remain so calm. She leaned toward the older gentleman sitting beside her and said softly, "He doesn't look upset. It's like he knows something." The older man gave a small chuckle. "Some people don't need to raise their voices. They let the truth speak for them. You'll see. This man isn't finished. The woman tilted her head, curious. What do you mean? The older man simply smiled. Patience. People like him, they carry power quietly. Back at the front of the cabin, the flight attendants prepared for takeoff. One of them passed by the CEO, offering him water. Her tone was neutral, far less enthusiastic than the one she used with the passenger in seat 1A. The CEO accepted it politely, thanking her with a nod. She walked away quickly, as if unsure how to handle him. The CEO took a sip of the water, set the glass down, and leaned back in his seat. His eyes closed briefly, not in sleep but in reflection. He thought about how often such situations happened not just to him, but to countless others whose names and titles did not carry weight. For them, there were no second chances, no hidden authority to reveal, no messages that could turn the situation around. They were simply ignored, dismissed, or humiliated. He opened his eyes again, determination shining in them. This wasn't just about him. It was about the principle. About dignity. About respect. And so, while most passengers thought the incident was already over, they had no idea that it was only beginning. In just a few minutes, everything would change. The very staff who had smiled at the wrong man and dismissed the right one would soon realize their mistake. For now, though, the CEO remained silent. Silent, but never powerless. The plane's door closed with a firm click. The captain's voice came over the speakers, welcoming everyone aboard. Passengers leaned back, ready for the journey ahead. The cabin appeared calm, yet just beneath the surface, anticipation stirred. Because somewhere between the moment he gave up his seat and the moment the engines roared to life, the story had already shifted. The balance of power was no longer with the staff who had forced him aside. It now rested quietly, invisibly, in the hands of the man they had underestimated. And though only 5 minutes had passed, the stage was set. Soon, the truth would walk down the aisle, and every eye in the cabin would see him not just as a man moved from his seat, but as the man who held the future of their jobs in his hand. Yes, the attendant continued. This seat, it's been reserved for another passenger. We'll need you to move to another spot. There's a seat available a few rows back. He frowned slightly, not out of anger but of confusion. I believe this is my seat, he said softly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his boarding pass. The ticket clearly showed, Seat 1A. He held it up for her to see. The attendant's smile tightened. Yes, I see that. But unfortunately, there has been a change. We'll need you to cooperate. At that moment, a middle-aged white man entered the cabin, dragging a small suitcase behind him. The attendant's eyes lit up as she greeted him warmly. Mr. James, welcome. This is your seat here, she said, pointing directly to 1A, the very seat the CEO had already occupied. The CEO glanced between the two, still calm. The white man smiled casually, as if everything was normal, and waited for the black man to stand up. The passengers nearby grew quiet. They could sense the tension in the air. I'm sorry, the CEO said firmly, yet still with respect. This is my seat. My ticket is here. There must be some mistake. But the attendant's voice grew sharper, though still coated with professional politeness. Sir, we don't want any problems. Please move to the seat we have assigned for you. It will still be in first class, just not this one. The CEO looked around. People were watching, some whispering to each other. He could see the unspoken question in their eyes, why is he being asked to move? Still, no one spoke up for him. The cabin was silent except for the sound of the engines humming faintly outside. He could have argued. He could have raised his voice and demanded his right. After all, he had every reason to do so. But instead, he sat there for a moment, studying the situation. Then, slowly, he stood up. His tall frame straightened, his face calm, his ticket still in his hand. "I see," he said quietly. "If that's what you need." He picked up his briefcase and stepped aside. The white passenger quickly slid into the plush seat, settling himself with a satisfied smile. The attendant leaned down to adjust his blanket, speaking with warm courtesy. Meanwhile, the CEO was shown to another seat farther back. It was still in first class, but it lacked the status and comfort of the VIP spot he had reserved. As he sat down, the cabin felt heavy with silence. A woman two rows behind whispered to her husband, "That didn't feel right." The husband nodded slightly, but they both stayed quiet. No one wanted to challenge the authority of the airline staff. The CEO, however, remained composed. He placed his briefcase by his side and pulled out his phone. His fingers moved across the screen as he typed a short message. His face gave away nothing, neither anger nor bitterness. Instead, there was a calmness, a quiet strength, almost as if he already knew what would happen next. Passengers around him continued whispering. Some shook their heads in disapproval, but none spoke aloud. Everyone knew what they had just witnessed, but they chose silence over confrontation. The staff continued moving up and down the aisle, smiling and serving drinks, pretending as though nothing unusual had happened. But for the CEO, the humiliation was real. He was not just asked to move, he was judged unfairly without a second thought. They didn't see a leader, a visionary, or a man who owned shares in the very airline they worked for. They only saw the color of his skin and assumed his value was less than the man who took his place. And yet, he did not explode in anger. He did not demand apologies. He knew something they did not know. He knew that within minutes, the truth of who he really was would come to light. And when it did, the same staff who dismissed him would wish they had treated him with the respect every human being deserves. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the atmosphere was tense. The passengers kept stealing glances at the calm man in the back row. They couldn't help but wonder, who is he really? Why does he look so unbothered, even after being pushed aside? In that moment, the CEO looked out the window, watching the workers on the runway guide the plane. His lips curved into the faintest smile. 5 minutes. That